Hi, thanks for stopping by our channel today. I'm Pete, and today we're going to look into the sun. The sun is out. It is a beautiful early spring day. We're going to get a few more things in the garden that have um, been coming up in the red cups down in our basement. So we've got a couple of green beans to plant, we've got 2 crookneck, and we've got our tomatoes to get in the ground today. So that's what we're doing today. About a week and a half ago, that was, I kind of call a Midwest storm. You know, after growing up in Kansas, you know how those Midwest storms come and they just, everything's fine, and then all of a sudden within 5 minutes, it's just a complete downpour. And that's kind of what happened last week. But fortunately, all the plants that we have in the ground, everything survived, which was nice. Now with tomatoes, and if you remember when we were talking about the potatoes, when I plant them in the red cups, I have the soil kind of halfway, and as the plant grows, I fill it. Because as you look at the tomato plant, on the stem, there is all these hairs sticking out. And those, when they come in contact with the soil, become roots. And so I'm planting these a little deep, and as they grow, I will be filling in even more. All right, let's get these crookneck squash in the ground. I was hoping that we were going to have at least 3 of these, but we only got 2 to actually come up. So I guess that's what we're going to have, at least for the start of the season. We're going to restart some more in the basement, and hopefully we will get those going. There we go. All right, we got the two crooknecks in, and the green beans. I know we have several more growing in the cups downstairs. These are the only 2 that are big enough. And realistically, if they don't grow very well, if they don't take off and start growing big, they could very well just be runt seeds. They're not going to be a very good producer. So what I'll probably do is just start some more, and we'll have some in a later season. So what I want to do is have 3 or maybe even 4 rows of green beans here. So, and it's good to stagger them, because that means you'll have some earlier plants and some later plants. They'll be producing, you know, the prime producing time will be staggered, so we'll have more early and more later. So we've got these in the ground. We're going to walk by and look at the potatoes in the potato pots, and then we're going to work on the steering box. I've taken the steering box for the tractor completely apart and cleaned everything. I ordered all new bearings and everything from Steiner Tractor. They're a really good source of parts, plus they have a lot of information and exploded pictures. So, you know, when you're like me, I've rebuilt a lot of steering boxes in my day, but On a tractor steering box, you have two sector gears, where most vehicles that have a steering box have one. So this was kind of an interesting disassembly. So I took it all apart, cleaned everything, and so what I'm going to do is this afternoon is we're going to work on reassembling that, and I'll show you some of the parts that we replaced and what was going on. If you remember, when we first got the tractor, they told me that there was a steering issue and it wouldn't turn left, which in the back of my mind, I kind of knew what it was, but when I found the bad bearing in the spindle assembly, I thought, okay, well, on the left side, I thought, okay, maybe that was it. But sure enough, when I took the steering box apart, I found the problem. So we'll go over that and why it happened, and why, or what we can do to fix it. Well, it looks like our raspberry plant has really taken off. Looking fantastic. Our potatoes, you can see these are the red potatoes, and those are looking pretty good. Our other red potato, that one's growing a little bit better. The third red potato, that one's doing pretty good. This one is just doing phenomenal. That's our Idaho or russet potato. This one's still sleeping. I don't think we're going to get anything out of that one. This is the other russet or Idaho potato. And then our other raspberry is just doing fantastic. They're really booming. All right, let's go down to the shop and get started on the steering column. So we've got our steering box completely apart. And what I've done is we took it apart and found that there were several bearings that had failed in it over the years. One of the bearings that we found was the upper steering shaft all the way up by the steering wheel. And the only way we knew that that had failed was that the bearing had been replaced with a homemade bushing. So it was a bushing that somebody made. And when we had the steering box all apart, we found a couple of small little BBs, just like 2 or 3 of them. And off the top of the bat, I couldn't tell where they'd come from. But as it turned out, when we got the new bearing, they had a lot of small little BB size bearings in them. So we figured out where that came from. Now on the steering shaft, down by the bottom, there are 2 bearings. One at the very bottom of the shaft and one slightly higher. So the bottom bearing and then another bearing that rides here. So that upper bearing of those 2 was completely gone. The cage had come apart and all the bearings were in the bottom of the steering box. So that would account for when you turn the wheel to the left, this is trying to lift. When you turn to the left, it tries to pull this up and it loads this bearing. But if this bearing isn't here, this will just crash into the bottom of the steering shaft. One way to tell if that bearing has failed is when you're turning to the left, have somebody else stand to the side of the tractor, and if the steering wheel lifts up, then that's what's going on. That bearing has failed. And most of the time, that bearing, if the oil level in the steering box isn't checked and maintained, that bearing over time won't have any oil in it, and it will just go bad. So make sure that you check the oil level in the steering box on a regular basis. But if the steering gets hard where you're turning it to the left, it's probably that top bearing. So I have the rear sector shaft. So we're going to go ahead and assemble that. So the steering sector shaft, there are two of them. This is the rear one, and it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 teeth on it. What we want to do when I clean this up, I wanted to make sure, because those bearings had gone bad, I wanted to make sure that there was no damage to any of these teeth. So looking at them, you want to make sure that one of those bearings one of the balls didn't fall down in there and break a tooth or damage a tooth. So fortunately, all the teeth on this turned out fine, so I don't see any damage to them. So what we're going to do, so this is that kit that came from Steiner for the sector shaft. And it's got a new nut, a new washer, a new seal, a new felt dust guard, new washers, new O-rings, and a new nut and tensioner bolt. So what we'll do, have a little bit of oil. We just want to make sure that we oil everything. And then we'll put the small washer on there. And we'll set this on its side. And then we'll take our mount, and with a little bit of oil, we will oil that big O-ring. And we'll install that and then spin it so that sometimes when you put the O-ring in, it can twist. And once you have it on, make sure you spin it, because if it has a twist in it, when you spin it, it will relax. And then we'll take some oil. We'll oil that bushing in here. I want to make sure that everything is lubricated. Then I usually like taking a small screwdriver and we want to be careful not to cross thread it. There we go. So don't force it on there. And then once it comes to a point, you can use a bigger screwdriver. Okay. And there we go. Let's get this on. We don't want to tighten it too tight, but just snug, maybe a half a turn from the very bottom. And then we have this tiny little seal, and that goes down inside of this little recess down here. So we'll put that on, put a little bit of oil on that, and then roll it down and push that down to the bottom. We'll take our bigger flat washer and put that on top, and then we'll take our nut and put that on. Just kind of leave it where we can. So just setting this how it's going to go, it will have the seal, then the felt, then the lock washer, and the nut. Now obviously the seal and the felt will go on once we assemble this in the housing, but just to keep all the parts square where they need to go, we'll just do that. So we're going to assemble the forward sector gear. I believe that's the right side of the steering box, the right side of the tractor. And it has gears on both sides. The rear only has teeth on one side. Unfortunately, it looks like you can see the factory marks on here. So that helps centering everything once you get it assembled. I got this side cleaned up. I still have the rear sector gear to clean, but I want to assemble one of these. I got the mount painted, and I've got the sector gear kit from Steiner Tractor, and it comes with the entire kit. It's really nice. It comes with all the seals and the felt. It comes with a new nut and washers, and even a new sector adjustment bolt. So this thing is really cool. And this is our big O-ring. So we'll just pop that in there. So with this new sector gear adjustment bolt, it takes one of these little flat washers and you slide it in just like that. And then I inspected the bushing inside here, and it looks like it's in really good shape. You can see, I don't know if you can see it in there, but it's still got the groove in it. So that's in really good shape. I put just a dab of grease in here just a minute ago. And then we will turn this bolt. Okay. And then in here, we have a new washer that goes on here. But before that goes in, there's a tiny little O-ring that goes in on the end of the, right there, on the end of the bolt. This is the old washer, and it's pretty flattened up and killed. So this is a new one. So we'll put that O-ring on there, and we'll just work it down. Okay. And then we have our new flat washer and a new nut. And we're not going to put that in too deep right yet, because once we assemble this, we're going to have to get the backlash correct in all the gears. But that's pretty much it for the sector gear as far as adjusting this part of it. So now we have the housing, and I kind of masked this off for paint because I didn't want the inside to get coated with paint. There we go. Now the first thing that we want to do in the bottom, to get that lower bearing race. So there's a race for this bearing in the very bottom. And to get to that, we had to knock out this little flat freeze plug in the very bottom. Once that's out, then we can use a chisel or a punch like this to knock the bearing race out. So now that that's out, and everything's painted, we need to put our freeze plug back in. And I haven't seen a lot of detail on this, but I would imagine that we would want to seal that because that will be pretty much at the bottom of all of the gear oil, the 90 weight that we're going to put in. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put some ultra black Permatex, just a skim of it right there on the outside, say 1/4 inch all the way around, because we just want that to seal. It doesn't have to be super thick, but there has to be enough there to seal. Okay. And then we'll take a magnet and put that right down in the very bottom of it. And it doesn't take a whole lot to drive it in there. So that's pretty much it. And then from our box of parts, we're going to pull out a new bearing. You got to be really careful with these because they're not really tight in. But we have our bearing and the bearing race. They come as a pair. So we're going to want to drive that down into the housing. So to do that, we're going to use our bearing driver and just set that in. I think what I'll do is I'll set it down there with our magnet, and that gets it pretty close to where it wants to be. And then we'll just tap it in. So make sure that that race seats all the way down in the bottom. If it's up just a little bit, it'll mess up all the preload, and over time it will set down and it'll make the steering all loose. So make sure that's driven all the way in. And when you're done, make sure that that freeze plug stays seated in the bottom. Now we'll work on this where the upper bearing goes. It goes up there. So take all our plugs out from painting. Now what they had done, somebody had done before I bought this tractor, they couldn't figure out what was going on with the steering, so they pulled, there's a little fill plug right here. And so what they had done, it's an 1/8 inch pipe thread. So they got a greaser and with 1/4 inch, with 1/8 inch pipe thread. And they put that in and they tried to pack the whole steering box full of grease. Obviously that did not fix the problem, and it made for a huge mess when I was cleaning this up. So now that we have this, we're going to make sure it's full of grease. Now on the bottom, this is where the other race goes. So these two bearings work against each other, and that makes the steering tight without being too loose. It's kind of like if anybody has set up a differential, it's kind of like a differential where you're setting the preload of the gears. It's too tight, it'll have way too much friction and it'll heat up. And if it's too loose, it'll wear and make a lot of noise. So this is our other race, and that just installs right here. There we go. Now, as you're driving this in, if there's any metal, these little teeny metal fragments that might come off of the aluminum on here or just whatever, make sure you get those cleaned out completely, because you don't want any kind of metal shavings in here. So this is the upper, and the way that they adjust, move that out of the way, the way that they adjust the preload on this, if you just bolted this together, it could mash those gears together and make the steering very tight. So when I disassembled this, there were a whole bunch of shims that went here. So what we're going to do is measure the thickness of those shims. There's like 4 or 5 different shims. We're going to measure that, and that'll be a good starting point. In our new kit from Steiner, they come with a bunch of new shims, and so we're going to use those to make sure that we get that preload just right. There's a whole bunch that come with this. So we're going to use that when we assemble this. And that's going to be the first thing that we do. We're going to get the steering shaft with our new bearings installed, get our preload right before we start doing the sector gears. Because if we don't get this, this is step one. If we don't get that right, then our sector gears won't be right either. Now, one thing that we need to do to get started with that is we need to remove this bearing. And there is a little push, almost kind of like a little tiny freeze plug that goes in the end of the shaft right there in the center. And it shouldn't take too much pressure to get this to come off. Just kind of work it and it'll just pop off. So we have this tiny, or this concave washer, and then this tiny little freeze plug that goes right in the center. So what we'll do is this bearing should just come off. Yep, just like that. And then our new bearing will just slide right on there. Let me wipe off any kind of dirt or anything that was on there. We'll put a fresh wipe of oil, and then we'll just put the bearing on. And then we'll take that washer and the little freeze plug, and we'll just drive it back in with the peen side. Just like that. Now we have that new bearing on there. So I put the second bearing on here. So now we have the bottom bearing and the top bearing. The way we're going to put this in is with the teeth pointing down. And just like that. Now, without any shims, if we were to put this on, there we go. So you see, if we tighten this up, that would crush the bearings together. So what I'm going to do, I took this old bearings, or this old shim stack, and I measured it, and it's 38 thousandths of an inch. And then out of the new shims that came from Steiner, I found two shims that are 38 thousandths. So we're just going to put those on and see where it lines up. And we'll see if that is going to be adequate, but at least it'll be a good starting point. So we'll put two of these bolts in. Now if it's too much distance, then this will be kind of loose. But if it's too small of a shim stack, then this will be too tight. So let's just snug these up. I'm not going to crank on them real hard, but I'm just going to tighten them up. And that feels really tight. I can feel the bearings. So what we're going to do, as I saw in here, so we're going to take this apart here and take this back out. And I think I saw one of these shims in here that was pretty thin. Let me see what this one is. So that's about 2 thousandths of an inch. So let's try that one. See if we can see where that falls. So you see what I said earlier, how getting this dimension right first before we do the sector gears is really important. Because if we put the sector gears in and try to adjust, then this won't give us, we'll have to go back and redo this again. Okay, that feels pretty tight still. I can feel each bearing, so it's kind of cuck, 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 like that. So I'm going to take that 1/3 thousandths shim out. And let me see, I think I found one that was about 5 thousandths. That one's 5 thousandths. Nope. So we'll take that out, and this one's just a couple thousandths bigger. So we'll see if that helps. And this is just one of those things that it's just going to take some time in getting right. But it is what it is. You know, we've got to get this right before we do anything else. Okay, so it just popped down. Oh yeah, so that feels perfect. So that 2,000th shim, you can see that's pretty thin, but that 5,000th shim, that made it just right. So now that works really well. All right. So what I'm going to do is put these other bolts in. We'll get those snugged up. Okay. There we go. Yeah. So that feels good. So we're going to put that plug back in here. So that's where we're going to fill. So as you look at this, that bearing in the bottom, when this is full of oil, the oil level is all the way up here. This is where you fill it. So that oil level is going to be up this high. And if the oil level isn't correct, this bearing that we just put in will be out of the oil, and over time, when you turn left, it wants to lift this shaft up because it's trying to turn the wheel. And if that oil isn't on that bearing, as you turn left, it'll just work that bearing over and over and over. And over the years, it'll just kill that bearing. So really important that we keep all the oil levels correct on this. Get some there. Okay, so we're going to put this on its side. And we're going to try to get this gear centered. So I've turned it all the way one direction. And I will, let me get a Sharpie. And we'll put a line on here. So when we turn it, we'll count the rotations. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so it looks like 3.5. So we'll go 1.5, and then 1/4. So that should be centered. So we're ready to put our right side sector gear in. Now you can see on the gears, on this side, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 slots. And on this side, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 slots. So if you remember, on that worm gear, there was only 4 teeth. So this 4 slots are going to line up with the 4 teeth. And there is a center, there's a mark on the center gear. So that's going to line up with our middle tooth on here. But before we get going on that, I'm going to put this seal in on this side. All right, there we go. So now that we got the seal done, let's put some oil on the shaft where the bushing is going to go. We're going to put this in and line that up just like that. Very gently tap it in. There's that seal there, and we don't want to tear the O-ring. So what I'm doing here is those teeth need to mesh correctly. If they're too tight, they'll jam. If they're too loose, there'll be too much slack in them. And you adjust that with the screw on the top of the sector gear. So under this, we're going to put that felt seal, and that just keeps dirt and dust from building up on the back side of this. Now we have our arms, and this one, yeah, I marked as right. I'm not going to put that on right yet because to do that it needs to stand up. But I'm just going to, there are 4 big shims in here, 4 big teeth in here. So I'm just going to line it up with another one, and I'm just going to put it on just loosely by hand. Once we get this on the tractor, we can tighten this up or loosen it up. But getting it pretty close right now is kind of important. So we'll put 2 of our bolts in that holds this sector gear in. Snug these up. Now there's no shims that go underneath these because the sector gear itself is adjustable. Okay, so now we have that, and that feels pretty tight. So I'm going to back this off just a little bit. Yeah, so right there. So just by tightening those bolts, that snugged it up a little bit. And there we have that. So now we have our first sector gear in. Let's see, here we go. So now we will take our left sector gear and we'll put the seal in on this side. There. So now we will look inside of here. We can see there's a mark where the center is. And on this, there's a mark on the center tooth. So let's put some oil on here. And our center gear, center tooth I should say, on the gear is going to be that one. And that is going to line up with the center gear on center tooth on this sector gear. There we go. There we go. Okay, that feels pretty good. I'm going to snug up the sector gear bracket. There we go. Okay, so that you can hear it. Got a lot of back play on that one. So I'm going to try to tighten that a little bit so it doesn't have as much free play in it. There we go, just like that. I'll snug that up and then, good. And now when we turn them, they both go as they should. We'll put the felt on this side. And for right now, I'm just going to put the nuts on both of these and the washers, because we're going to assemble these once we get it up on a block. But before we do that, I'm going to take this piece, I'm going to pull out the caps that I put in here for painting. There we go. This go down here. But before we put that on, let's see, we need our top bearing. So to put this in, that just taps in. There, just like that. Well, there we go. So now that we have our steering box up on these blocks, we can put there our steering arms on. Not quite sure of the exactly which spot they go in, but once we get it back on the tractor, we'll be able to tell. But there, now as I turn it, you can see they're working as they should. So there we have it. We've got our steering box all back together. We'll get it, once we get it back on the tractor, we'll fill it with oil and make sure that everything's good. Make sure that we don't have any leaks. But it seems to be working properly now. Once we got it apart, we were able to find the bearing that was bad, so that's always good to, when you have a problem with something, to actually find a problem that would cause that. You know, many times you go in looking for a problem and you can't find anything, and then when you put it all back together, it works and you don't know what you did. So this was good that we were able to find that bad bearing. I'm pretty sure this is the same steering box. They're pretty similar for all the ends. The 2N, the 9N, and the 8N. And for the Golden Jubilee and the Jubilee. Very well could be very similar to the number series, like the 600 and on up. The 600, 700, 800. We got quite a bit done today. We were able to get the rest of the vegetables in the garden, and we were able to get the steering box back together. So that was a pretty successful day, I'd say. I hope this helped you with your tractor. If this inspired you to try to tackle a steering box by yourself, I would encourage it. You know, there's nothing like doing something to be able to learn about it. If this helped you, please give us a thumbs up on the video, and if you haven't done so, please subscribe. It would definitely help us out, build our channel. I appreciate you stopping by, and we'll catch you on the next one.